Welcome back. This is the last in this quarter's seminar series on wildfires, and appreciate the audience and all the questions. And those of you on YouTube land, appreciate you joining in too as well, and appreciating the interest. I'm especially appreciative to the Bill Lane Center for the American West, the Woods Institute for the Environment, as well as Stanford Sustainable Data Science, who have sponsored this seminar series. We've had a great series, and we are going to wrap it up with an awesome talk today. We are pleased to have Luisa Rapport here from Stanford. She is Director of Emergency Communications and Media Relations at Stanford University's Communications Office, where she is responsible for planning and carrying out much of the university's emergency messaging, and is a contributor among the school's group of emergency managers. Yet she's not just an emergency communications person. She has spent the majority of her career working in the space of wildfires and fire service, first as a firefighter and eventually as a public information officer. She has worked with both local and state incident management teams, tasked with leading some of California's most complex emergency incidents. She holds a master's degree in emergency service administration and has also spent time advising Bay Area organizations on their emergency preparedness, training, and response. Since joining Stanford, she has continued to apply her expertise and passion in the area of wildfire management as a member of the university's Wildfire Management Steering Committee. So welcome, Luisa, and welcome to the audience. And we look forward to a great, engaging talk and conversation today. Thanks. And I will stop sharing my screen so you can take over.
Awesome. Thanks, Derek. And thanks, everybody, for coming. I do recognize a few faces in the audience as folks that I work with directly at Stanford. One of my favorites, I see Xander out there, who is a student and also out at Jasper Ridge. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides. I don't want to bore everybody with a ton of slides today, but I do want to keep on track. All right. Can everybody see that all right? Perfect. Okay. Okay, so like Derek said, I came to Stanford with a relatively unique set of skills and experience. My resume is not something that you might typically see for someone working in higher education. I come from the fire service, so I started out as a seasonal firefighter with CAL FIRE in 1999. I'm always proud to say I legally drove a fire engine before I was legally allowed to drink. So I spent 3 years working for CAL FIRE, working on an ambulance down in Monterey County, and just learning everything I could basically about wildland fire. And then post 9/11, there was a lot of funding that went into Homeland Security, a lot of new positions, and I ended up being hired with Santa Clara County Fire Department as a full-time firefighter. So through that, I also worked in private sector as an emergency manager. So, translating what I learned in the fire service and a lot of those concepts into private industry and education has been something that I've been doing for a long time, and I see an incredible value in. So it's something I get to kind of do here at Stanford as well. And the reason I'm in communications is because my last position in the fire department was as a public information officer. So I really now specialize in primarily emergency communications. But again, the fire service, how does it translate to academia, right? Fire service is it's paramilitaristic. It's a very top-down organization. It's very physical. Not a lot like what you might see in academia or expect to see in academia, right? We're very collaborative here. We will be what we consider a flat organization. I would say I stare at a screen a little bit more often than I used to here. I don't know about the personal habits of researchers, but I know in the fire service, everyone is very superstitious. Everything comes in threes. If you put on a new pair of boots, you're going to get a fire. I'm not sure how that translates to academia. But what I do want to say is, while they seem very, very different, I think that as we move along with my presentation, I'm going to argue that they're more similar than they are different. And more importantly, I think we have a lot to learn from each other, and a lot to collaborate on, especially in the wildfire management space. So I'm going to share a little bit about my journey, about what I'm doing here at Stanford and what I've been involved in working in, and we'll come back to this piece at the end. So like I said, I started in the fire service as a seasonal for CAL FIRE in 1999. I was assigned to Santa Cruz County, that's a ranger unit, Santa Cruz San Mateo County. And that year happened to be an outlier year for CAL FIRE and for wildfires. There were just over 11,000 fires burning almost 1.2 million acres that year. That is combined state, local, and federal land in California. And that was primarily due to, we had this August lightning series that came across Northern California, not unlike what we had here a couple of years ago, that sparked a lot of individual lightning strike fires. I do remember that in Santa Cruz County and responding to that at that time. And then we had a lot of late season fire weather. So November, December, we saw the Santa Ana winds, those hot, dry winds pick up in Southern California. At the time, we called it the worst fire season ever. 1999 was the worst fire season ever. And if you've ever been in the fire service or around people in the fire service, right about April, you start hearing them say, it's going to be the worst fire season ever, right? And at that time, we were kind of right. But really, again, no strong impacts across the state. We didn't have smoke inundation in different counties. It was what we had grown to know and manage as a fire season in California. And what I learned was kind of the norm. And again, it only brought the 5-year average at that time up to just over 500,000 acres in California. That was up from about 400,000 the year before. And then it dipped back down. Now let's jump to my last year in the fire service, 2021. There were less fires, almost 7,400 fires, but we burned almost 2.6 million acres in 2021, which brought our 5-year average to 2.1 million acres. And that was closely following the 2020 year that burned 4.3 million acres. So this was just another year on top of another year on top of another year. And by this time, we're talking, this is the new normal. And we saw some very significant statewide impacts to our mutual aid system, to all of our fire agencies around the state. We saw impacts in the Bay Area, right? We had the red day, basically the orange day, where smoke inundated the Bay Area during those 2-year periods. And then we had that on top of our ongoing pandemic response, right? So all of these responders were also dealing with the weight of responding to the pandemic. So I just want to kind of set that tone for you. I know you've seen a lot of data so far in these talks, but I think those are kind of the high points I want to leave you with. Ooh, sorry, too far. Okay, so, and I think that in a couple of your presentations, they've talked about the largest fires in the state. I don't know if anyone has provided this kind of graphic. I think it's a really good representation of it. And the takeaway here, right? 18 of the top 20 largest wildfires in California have occurred since the year 2000. And 9 of those occurring just in the 2020 and 2021 fire season. I worked both of those fire seasons. I think I was just during the summer months, I think I was deployed 6 to 8 weeks out of the summer in both of those years. And that's on top of pandemic response and all of those other things. So, this was a very, very, very big strain on our resources, right? So I know we've all looked at this data before. I know we all understand the climate implications, actually the climate aspects that are causing this new landscape. and the climate implications that they're producing. But I want everyone to take a step back and look at these fires from the perspective of resources. Okay. The climate crisis, as related to wildfires, is not just a solution issue, right? It's a scale issue. And I want to talk about scale. So this picture, just to give a little background, this was down in Orange County. I believe it was probably the end of maybe 2021 fire season, at what was called the Bond Fire, late season, just before, I think, Thanksgiving, just after Thanksgiving, down in Orange County. Now, this was a relatively small fire. I want to say it was like a 10,000 acre fire, and we stood up a whole base camp for it. And this is a small base camp, and you can see it goes about as far as the eyes can see. And when I say a base camp, this is the infrastructure that it takes to support a response to one of those large wildfires. And this is a small infrastructure in comparison. We were responding to this fire specifically because we knew that there was another incidence of Santa Ana winds coming, and we wanted to wrap this fire up. It was in the old Silverado burn scar. And we wanted to wrap this fire up before there was a potential for it to ignite again. So when I talk about scale, right, fire departments are generally, the fire service, they are experts in scale. We have long used what's called the incident command system. If you don't know what that is, you can certainly look it up and take any number of really long, boring primers on it if you want to know about it. But it is basically a standardized organizational structure. It originated, I believe, in the Coast Guard, in the military. And it's used for responding to all levels of emergencies. The way I like to describe the incident command system is it's a language that you learn so that everyone is speaking the same language and talking about the same thing. So everything is very, very well orchestrated through this incident command system. We also have what's called the California Mutual Aid System. That originated very, very early, like in the 1950s, post-World War II, and then with wildfires became extraordinarily useful in California. And the mutual aid system, what it does is it gives fire agencies the ability to consistently share resource when an incident, and when I say incident, I'm talking about an emergency, a wildfire. I'll use the term incident synonymously with like a large scale emergency. So when an incident exceeds local capabilities, this is how we're bringing in resources from other areas of the state without straining any one agency to the point where they can't handle their own local emergencies. And the mutual aid system, it was created for wildfires, but since it's been applied to all types of emergencies all across the US. Hurricanes, all types of, FEMA has task force teams now that respond through a similar mutual aid system. And the mutual aid system isn't just limited to the firefighters on the ground, right? I just talked about, we have all of this infrastructure behind every incident, and the personnel that are needed to manage these complex incidents. And so while the mutual aid system has served California and the United States extremely well, it was still built for these low frequency, high risk, or high complexity events. Not what we would call like the perma crisis that we're facing right now, like the one after another, after another, after another. So it's kind of almost like a balloon, right? Like you're blowing up that balloon and then releasing it, and blowing up that balloon and releasing it. But if you keep that balloon blown up beyond its capacity, it's not what it's built for, right? So one of the components of this is that the fire service, has really had to become more efficient. They've had to become more agile and work with less resources sometimes, because the scale of and impact of these fires across California have generated the resource needs that really strain the system. So one of the ways that we, as kind of a fire service, have increased our efficiency and our capability over the last decades is by creating these incident management teams. And these are state-run teams. There's 6 of them currently in the state of California that are type 1, the highest level teams. And it's essentially like bringing in a toolbox to an incident. In that toolbox is every person you need in the management structure of that incident. So everything from the incident commander, who is the very boss of the incident, all the way to people like me that are public information officers, to finance that figures out who's reimbursing for this incident. And so I was fortunate enough to right around just in 2018 become part of these incident management teams. I primarily worked with Team 4. Doesn't matter, there's 6 of them. Unless you ask Team 4, then you'll know that they're the best, of course. But I had the opportunity to work on these teams and deploy with these teams and be one of sometimes 50 or 60 public information officers at any given time on a fire. And what I learned is these teams are really the best of the best. They are incredible at what they do. And I'll talk about it just from right now, the public information side. They're incredible communicators. They're incredible at embedding themselves into the communities that they're serving on at the time when the community is having literally their worst days ever. And they're incredibly efficient at managing these incidents. I learned more lessons with these management teams than I think I've ever learned in the whole rest of my career combined. The first incident I went on was the Camp Fire in 2018 and was a public information officer managing the daily press conferences that for one of the first times, right, in 2018, we were finally streaming these press conferences. At the time, it was being streamed by my cell phone to hundreds of thousands of people over Facebook. And I was managing, when we would embed ourselves in these communities, we would take that region's social media channels. So I was managing the social media channels on behalf of CAL FIRE and sharing all of the information. We coordinated a presidential visit. So all of the things kind of behind the scenes that you don't see happening, that's what this incident management team is doing. I also, outside of that management team, but within our local county management team in 2019, I ended up working as a public information officer for close to a week following the Gilroy Garlic Festival shooting that happened, and worked with the FBI on that. So when we talk about these incident management teams and mutual aid, this is kind of how it applies outside of fires, right? So it applied just as well to this mass shooting as it did to the Camp Fire. And then in 2020 and 2021, I was assigned as the lead PIO to the Santa Clara County Vaccine Clinic for first responders. So in 2020, when the vaccine came out, the county had these doses and needed to prioritize them to responders, but didn't have a way to do that distribution or figure out how to do that distribution. So the fire department said, hey, we're good at this. We're good at scaling. We can do this. And so we stood up a clinic, and over the course of about 5.5, 6 months, we ended up vaccinating every first responder, every police officer, every county employee, every teacher, and every public transportation worker in the county of Santa Clara and a little bit beyond. And that's just kind of an example of like how we scale operations very quickly and with, relatively minimal resources. And, we're incredible experts at it. When I say we, the fire service is incredible experts at it. So how does that apply to what I'm doing today? Good question. So one of the biggest lessons that I learned, before I move on to this, does anybody have any questions about that, or just those experiences, the data? No questions? Okay, perfect. So what I learned about emergency communications, and probably the simplest lesson, is communications are key, obviously, but it's about the right message to the right audience at the right time. So all of that time I spent working in the fire service and communicating, I realized that there are all these different ways that people communicate, and you have to meet them in those ways, right? Your information is really valuable, but it's not valuable at all if it's not reaching the people that it needs to go to. And as a university, we now have to reach more people across more platforms, and we're expected to do that more quickly than we ever have before, right? And we're expected to do it, with, transparency. And so that's something that, bringing what we've done in the fire service in that scale, how does that apply to Stanford? So what I started to do is I looked at the ways that we were communicating across the university with our emergency communications. I looked at the platforms that we were communicating with. And we have a lot of resources here at Stanford in our university communications. So things like social media, social monitoring, that were kind of a luxury for me out on the fire ground, are kind of our norm here. So those are the kind of things that we really have in spades here. But with the changing climate, what we're seeing is the frequency of some of the emergencies on campus are increasing significantly, to the point where we need to provide these emergency communications way more often than we ever did in the past. Power outages, for example, I think about 2 months after I arrived here at Stanford in June of 2022, we had a significant power outage caused by the Edgewood fire up in Woodside area. And since then, I think we've had probably, gosh, I'd have to look at the numbers, but over a dozen power outages across campus since then. And so where that was kind of like one of those low frequency incidents, now it's something where we're saying, this is a norm, and we're going to have to respond to this continuously. So what does that mean? It means we need to scale. It means we need to have more people ready to respond to these and communicate on these more often, on a university level. So applying that same efficiency, that same scalability of instant communications to our emergency alerting and communications has been really successful to us. And that's even through social, right? So whereas out on the fire ground, I may have been in areas in far Northern California where I may have found that the community just had a general distrust for social media or distrust for traditional media. And the best way to go was to go out physically and reach these community members and find that one person in the community that is kind of their truth teller, and connect with them. Whereas here at Stanford, we are very, very keyed into social, right? And so if we don't have an emergency message up on social very, very quickly after the lights go off, or very, very quickly after something happens, people will be pinging us, asking us, where is it, where is it, where is it? So it's knowing that audience, right? For your information, that picture on the far right is a typical evening at 7:01 p.m. at the campfire. And that was like the level of national news that was there every single night waiting for us to do our press conferences. So it was a really incredible experience doing that. Now, I want to talk about how this also applies to wildfire management at Stanford. So I want to shift gears a little bit. So this is all great, Luisa. You do good communications. You're applying those communications at Stanford. We're going to be able to scale them in an emergency and keep everything running. But what does that have to do with wildfire management? So I I don't know if anyone else at Stanford has experienced this, but kind of the funnest part of being here is that if you're a subject matter expert in something, or even if you just have a real like passion for something, the other people will find you, right? So I'm not sure how I got looped into it, but I'm so thankful that I did. But shortly after I came here, someone came to me and said, hey, we have this wildfire management plan steering committee. Would you like to be part of it or come to a meeting? And all I heard was like Stanford and wildland fire, and I was in, because that was, the one piece that I really am still passionate about. It doesn't matter if I'm a firefighter or not, I'm still passionate about it. And so I have had the opportunity to work with some great people across campus, great people at Jasper Ridge, working on wildfire management plans and programs and projects for Stanford. And there's three things that I like to focus on that I've seen at Stanford that I really like to support in this wildfire management, based on my experiences in the fire service. So the first one is amplifying research and information, sharing these great stories and this great research that's coming from Stanford with the rest of the world and with the right people. Walking the walk. So one of the things that I was also pleasantly surprised to find out at Stanford was that not only do we have a wildfire management plan that is updated regularly, but we are also doing all of the projects that the plan is recommending, right? As the largest private landowner in Santa Clara County, I still didn't know what to expect coming here. And frankly, I didn't hear much about Stanford when I was working down the street at County Fire, which is kind of what told me a little bit about this amplifying research and information, right? Like why was I working for the fire department that serves Stanford in wildfire, but I wasn't hearing about what they were doing, what their plan was. But I was so pleasantly surprised to find that this plan is being engaged. There are projects that are going on. We're doing this work. And that's something incredible that I can support. And then the last one, and I think that the key one, the one that I want to leave you with, and we'll talk more about, is connecting the experts. And that's not just experts here at Stanford, but that's experts all over the region. And again, we'll talk about that in just a minute. But first, I want to talk about this amplifying research and information. So really cool part of my job, that working in media relations, I get to do proactive communications as well. I don't just respond to like inquiries that come in, but I get to see all of this cool research and information come across our desks, and I get to share that information out. Now, when I talked earlier about the right message to the right people at the right time, this is what we're capitalizing on, these opportunities to proactively share research with external media. And I'll give you an example of this. So that Washington Post tweet that's in the center of your screen. So if you all remember, in late September, we had this like very quick and very random inundation of smoke in the Bay Area that came from some Northern California and Oregon wildfires. Well, coincidentally, some research had just been released, led by Marshall Burke from the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability, on wildfire's influence on pollution trends. And that piece of research was ready to go out. And so we took the opportunity that day of the smoke inundation to share this research. And it got some really good traction. And what it did too is it was that moment of opportunity where not only did we reach the right people, but more people became the right people, right? Our audience, we hit that moment when people could not ignore it because it was literally surrounding them. And we got really, really, really good traction on this research. We followed that up, the one on the right, you can see with what we call the home top. So kind of towards the end of fire season, we pitched out to specific media outlets, just kind of a collaboration of lots of different research in the wildfire space. And that generated a few interviews and talks that individuals were doing, especially based on the Maui fires, right? So a lot of people that were covering the aftermath of the Maui fires found their subject matter experts through this pitch. So I am a huge advocate in sharing all of the great research that's happening, because I think a lot of times for researchers, right, you do this great research and you share it with your science journals, but you're sharing it with like other researchers, and that's fantastic, but it's still a little bit like you're sharing it in a bit of a silo, right? So the more we can get it out to the public, to other responders, to other people that are thinking in this space, the more valuable that research becomes. So that's something that I really advocate for, and I really, really actively try to find opportunities to share that information. We also share some of the things that great work that we're doing on the ground. So at Jasper Ridge, they are currently doing a project where they're creating some piles of vegetation, that they're doing some vegetation management efforts, and those piles will eventually be burned in kind of the early part of next year. And we wanted to do two things. One is highlight all of the great vegetation management that Jasper Ridge is doing, the fact that they've basically created this living lab where they can research while they're doing these projects. And we also want to let our community know, hey, this is happening, this is what you're going to see, and kind of getting them ready to be accepting of the fact that we're going to set these piles on fire eventually in a very, very safe way. So that's kind of on the information piece. Like, I think there's incredible value in the way that we're sharing not just our research, but also our projects with external media, with our community members. Now, the next thing, walking the walk. So I think this is pretty straightforward, but if you haven't taken a look at Stanford's wildfire management plan, the 2022 plan will be coming out, 2023 plan will be coming out soon. But this is the most recent plan. You can see down at the bottom of your screen, that's where you can find it. What I'm most proud about this plan, right, is yes, we plan and we perform our annual vegetation management projects across Stanford lands, but with every year and every iteration of this plan, we are working to improve the understanding of these areas of risk, right? So CAL FIRE may release their maps once every unknown how many years, right? I think the last one came out in 2007, and we're just getting the new ones out now. But we are moving forward with doing our own mapping. We are moving forward with ground truthing these areas to visually see what the areas of risk are. And we're taking that information back to enhance our practices. We're looking at research that's coming out for practices. What are the new best practices? How do we protect our resources? I think the land stewardship piece at Stanford is a huge component of it that can be a model across the state and across the region, because I think a lot of places look at land stewardship or land conservation and think that maybe that can't go with wildfire management, right? Those haven't been synonymous in the past. And I think we're kind of proving that it is synonymous, and it needs to be synonymous moving forward. And we're also incorporating every advancement in technology that we can. I think we do an incredible job of like mapping and remapping, and what's the new mapping feature and what other technology can we use. And then since I've been here, kind of the drum that I continually beat is collaborating with our regional efforts. So I know Seth is on the call from the Fire Safe Council. Probably the first thing I did when I got involved in wildfire management at Stanford was, we need to get the Fire Safe Council on board. They have the community wildfire protection plan. We need to share what we're doing so they can put it in there so that they know. And I had the opportunity when I was with County Fire to be one of the PIOs on the Highway 17 fuel break project, which at the time was, I think, California's largest and most complex fuel break project in the state. It went all the way from Los Gatos up to the summit on Highway 17. And I worked very, very closely with the Fire Safe Council on that, as well as CAL FIRE. And so I've seen what those like really beneficial collaborative efforts can do. And when we're looking at this issue of scale, we can't be the only ones working on it, right? We have to scale our efforts. And last but not least, my absolute 100% favorite. So remember back at the beginning of this talk, when I mentioned that I would argue that the fire service and Stanford, or even higher education in general, are much more similar than they might appear. So I talked about how different it was. Yeah, my life was very different before, in the before times. But here's what I've learned since I've come to Stanford. We are both inherent problem solvers. Firefighters are problem solvers by nature. So are researchers and those of us in higher education. We're the best of the best, right? Stanford is known for attracting the best students, the best athletes, the best researchers. And in the fire service, you are the best of what you do, hands down, every time, right? When that fire engine comes to your house, you know you're getting the right person for the job. We're all passionate about what we do. I think that I can speak for myself in that firefighters generally, it becomes part of their persona, right? Like everyone in your neighborhood, when you work for the fire department, knows that you're the firefighter in the neighborhood, right? So whether you want to or not, it really becomes part of your persona. And I think too, working at Stanford, it's the same, right? You are very proud of it. It becomes part of who you are, not just what you do. We're all students of the craft, right? We're all constantly curious, constantly seeking knowledge. And that really carries, both of these fields in what we do. And finally, between these two groups, we know more about wildfires, I think, than anybody else in the world. If you partner research and academia with the people that are on the ground in the fire service, you have the whole picture of wildfire management. But with that being said, so I think I've proven that we really are more similar than we are different. But with that being said, I would say it's not typical to see these two groups collaborate. It's not so usual to see firefighters and researchers and our facilities personnel out collaborating ahead of some pile burns that we're going to do. So what we're doing, and Sheena's on the call from Jasper Ridge as well, and she's really, I want to say, I have to give her credit because she's leading the majority of this project. We're working to accomplish this regular collaboration between our local fire service agencies, our researchers, and our project managers. And in this, we can put this research into practice. We can conduct new research with experts from other fields involved. So bringing firefighters into this, and fire personnel and community members into this living lab environment where they can see what we're doing, where they can give input, where they can share their experiences, I think is the key to really maximizing our efforts in this space. We want to come up with better solutions for wildfire management, and those combined experiences are what can help us do that. And then the other thing is we want these agencies to amplify our messages, right? Again, it's scale. We need more people talking about this. We need more people excited about it. And I want these agencies, I want these groups to come and get excited about what we're doing and then get excited about the solutions and then take it back and share it. Because I think that's kind of one thing, I found that all of my time working in Santa Clara County in the fire service, and I didn't know that there was this gem at Stanford of effort, right? Of research and effort and this living lab. I had no idea that all of this existed. And I think there's this just absolute incredible opportunity to partner regionally and get everybody else exposed to what we're doing here. So I think that's the last piece of the puzzle. And that's kind of, if you couldn't already tell, that's what I'm very passionate about. And that's what I'll continue to be passionate about. So that's it for my formal presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
Lisa, that was really great. I really appreciate your insights and thank you for your years of service leading up to where you are now. And yeah, I'll open the floor to questions. I have some too, but I'll let the audience have a shot first.
Yeah, thanks, Louisa. That was a really great presentation. And we're so lucky to have you at Stanford. It's really been great to work with you and how much you bring to all this, the wildfire work we're doing. One thing you were talking about, like communicating the right way to the right people in the right words. And one thing that I've noticed over the last few years is we are increasing the vocabulary around the public for things like defensible space. Like that's a very common word now. Home hardening is very common now. That wasn't always the case. Do you see any trends now for like things that are getting more familiar, or any like maybe misrepresentations, or what can we start talking about more now?
So yeah, that's a really good question. I do think that like home hardening, defensible space, all of the zones have really become part of our lexicon, especially in California. And I would say this too, is that we were talking about the right time also. And so there's always that opportunity of like, when can we communicate these things so that people are going to absorb it and take action? And where we had this really narrow window in the past, like leading up to fire season, of really, gosh, just trying to get people to engage. And they're coming off of like the rainy season, like, meh, whatever, right? What really happened, unfortunately, was the CZU and the SCU complex fires, right? So I talk about in 1999, when I first started and we had this lightning series. So at that time, there was a joke amongst firefighters. We called the Santa Cruz Mountains the asbestos forest. It's never going to burn, right? Like we used to be like, oh, where do you work? Oh, I work in Santa Cruz County. Oh, you never get any fires. You work in the asbestos forest. And lightning series would come in and we would wait a day or maybe 2 days, fly the area, see what smokes would come up, and then go hike in and take care of those fires, right? So very different from what is now the experience from the CZU complex fire, the SCU complex fire, where that summer up in the Los Gatos Mountains, we were getting relative humidities of like 1 to 3, which is something that I never could have imagined happening. I mean, to the point where I messaged up like our fire weather expert and was like, is this right? Is the RAWs really right today? Like, are you sure about this? But that has created an opportunity, right? So people have now lived it. And it has created a much broader opportunity to communicate out to people any time of the year and say, hey, now is the time to prepare. And we talked about this a little bit with the pile burning, right? Like sometimes it's difficult for people to be receptive to this, even when we share excellent research that says that these low intensity, burns are good for wildfire management. But now we have this bigger window of opportunity to share this because people have really experienced the reality of it. And I think there are more like, what do I think is on the horizon for lexicon, quite honestly? And I can't remember the way that it's changed, but there used to be like, there was Ready, Set, Go. And now, so we have Ready, Set, Go. But now they're talking about like a few additional, besides Ready, Set, Go, there's also one that's like LA County just developed it, I believe. That's where I saw it. But it's if you can't go, right? If you can't evacuate, and this is kind of going back to 2018 Camp Fire, where the roadways just couldn't hold that capacity. They are not made for that capacity to get out of a town that quickly. No amount of vegetation management was going to change that. And so now when we say Ready, Set, Go, there's also like getting to a safe place in your own, yes, Seth says shelter in place. They're calling it something slightly different down in Southern California, but finding a safe area of refuge, right, versus evacuating may be better for you. And we're reaching, I think the fire service in general is reaching a lot of communities where there are not great solutions for evacuating, right? They've kind of built themselves into a little bit of a corner or chosen to live in these mountainous, WUI areas where the reality of it is you might not evacuate with the way conditions are now. So like reframing what people understand about evacuating from fires, I think might be like the next thing coming a little bit. So they better understand that. Pre-evacuations. So like my last year in the fire service, I started promoting some, like especially for some of our stables, like up in Saratoga area, Los Altos Hills, if they have stables, is moving their livestock during red flag days, so that should something happen, they're already secured. They don't have to worry about it. It's a pre-evacuation step. So those are kind of some of the other things. Yeah.
Great question, Sheena. Seth, do you have a question? I see you're off mute.
Oh, I'm just listening and enjoying it.
Okay. Well, I'd like to follow up.
Sorry.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
ahead.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that great presentation. I wanted to follow up on your point about, right message to the right audience. And the flip side of that is having some place for someone people can contact, where the public can reach out, and what's the sort of listening platform that goes along with the outreach.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. Two-way communication, right? Like we can never just be communicating out. We have to be receiving communications as well. I was just talking to a good friend who is still on the incident management team about this. And when we talk about like our incident management teams, technology is great, right? Sharing those messages out are great. And sometimes we can respond to them depending on the capacity that we have. However, there is no replacement, I think, for in-person communications where you can listen to people. So when I was working with the CAL FIRE incident management team, we were still going out every day and putting up information boards and doing what we call trap lines, which is kind of an old term from hunting. But every day you would go drive this route and stop at the community centers, at the gas stations, at the evacuation sites, and talk to people in the community and find out what their needs were, find out what their concerns were, find out who was coming down from the mountains in the town, in the neighborhood that wouldn't evacuate, and tell us what you needed, right? So I think the same concept applies to us, right? So when we're doing a like vegetation management project, it's not just about what we're publishing, it's about reaching out to specific neighbors along the way, to hearing their concerns. Getting on, Portola Valley Forum is one of the places where we post, because then we can get information back on what those residents are talking about. So I think you're absolutely right. Two-way communications are critical.
Thanks for the question, Anna. I want to follow up actually on that a little bit, and maybe this might be for Sheena as well. Have you received any pushback on the pile burning plans in Jasper Ridge? And just there's still, I would say, from what I've seen, a general misconception, misunderstanding, or fear of prescribed burns, yet I'm preaching to the choir here. We know it's so important. So have you learned something yet, or maybe the rebellion hasn't come yet, about how you negotiate communication and public opinion about something like that?
Yeah, I'm sure Sheena will have something to add to this. I can tell you from my perspective, right? I'm always the one in these conversations that says, of course we can do pile burning, right? Because I used to wear a badge. I used to be the one that like people would come to and say, oh, they're burning, it's the fire department. Okay, right, it's very safe. In Santa Clara County, we do a pretty significant burn out at Grant Ranch every year. And it puts up this huge column of smoke over the South Bay. And nobody really cares, right? Like they're so used to it happening every year that we don't get much pushback. It's also in not a very well-developed area, right? It's pretty far away from the closest neighborhood. So I'm always the one that kind of goes in and is like, we can do this. This is no problem. But also, yes, I think that the key to it is reaching out to those neighbors, to hearing their concerns, to understand, like really understand their concerns, really be authentic about it. We have had some pushback, and it's everything from like the one person that says, how can you be doing this? This is completely insane, to someone else saying, I just want more details. I just want to be more informed. And I think honestly, for me, that's where I want to have that like one-on-one communication, because if someone just comes in and says, this is crazy, how are you doing this? That's a very emotional response. It's not fact-based, but it's also not going to be tempered by fact, right? They need their emotions to be addressed. And
Yes.
so that's where like I want to have that one-on-one conversation with them. And I think too, that's where the kind of having a relationship with those neighbors, right? Jasper Ridge has their stewardship program where some of the neighbors are involved in that. Having relationships ahead of the time is going to be really helpful. Fostering that trust ahead of time is going to be really helpful. And then, you know, I like the biggest recommendation I made was we need to have patches and badges at this burn, which meaning like you need to have people that look like officials from these local agencies here to help people feel comfortable with it. So,
Yeah.
Sheena, what have you experienced?
Yeah, I think you captured most of it, all of it. Most of it has been curiosity. It's been very little, like very big pushback, which I'm pleasantly surprised about. I was expecting a little bit more. On the other hand, as we're talking and doing more face-to-face communication, I am noticing we haven't reached everybody. And so then it also makes me think like we haven't maybe reached the vocal part of the community yet. So I think it's still possible. There might be stronger pushback, but right now it's been very much curiosity and like wanting to know more information, which is something we can definitely do. And then I'll also add, we've been working closely with the Woodside Fire Protection District. They want to work with us together on communication, which I think is so great.
Yeah.
And so that's one of those things, as Luisa was just saying too, like having the badges there present, like they want to engage with this early. And I just think that's so wonderful. And this having this collaborative effort, I think it's going to make this positive.
Thank you very much for both of you. Xander, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I got a question. Well, I guess there's a comment on like thanks for the great presentation and whatnot. You mentioned earlier how Stanford's a very flat organization, which means that especially working at Jasper Ridge, we have kind of this dual challenge of both communicating out to the community and our neighbors, and especially, but also communicating within Stanford. Just because it's not necessarily like we say Stanford as if it's one unit or one, you know, block of people, but there's people all over the place. How do you have any insight on how you either change your messaging or your outreach or whatnot when you're talking about internal communications versus external communications?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for the question. And thank you for being interested in wildfire management, because I love seeing kind of like a new generation of students coming through that are interested in it. So yeah, I spent some time on campus at Facebook years, for probably 6 or 7 years, being embedded there doing emergency management. And I thought I understood what a flat organization was working there, right? Working in tech. And then I came to Stanford and I realized how truly decentralized we are here. But also how that feeds kind of, it allows for the creativity and the collaboration that happens at Stanford. So I wouldn't change it. But yeah, it is interesting because you have all these different groups that you want to communicate to. And sometimes even ones that you think would be receiving the same message are not. And that's something that, you know, honestly, we find challenging even here in university communications. And frankly, I think like the answer is kind of with you, because we want people like you, people who are students, to share the message, right, with other students. And I think also not so much sharing not just sharing the information, but I think it's sharing the curiosity and sharing the passion for it, right? Because nobody gets into something because they saw this like data and we're like, oh, that data is really interesting, I'm going to go into that field, right? No, it's because it's something that you just are connected with, you feel passionate about, right? Maybe for you, it's because it's where you grew up, right? Near Yellowstone, or, but whatever it is, it's that piece of the information that makes you feel something, that makes you say, I want to know more about this. And then the other thing is, we live in this world of sound bites, right? So the smaller and more frequent messages that you can get out, the better. Nobody wants to read a 3-page like Stanford Report article. They want the tiny little like paragraph at the top that's like the abstract, right? Because we are so used to just scrolling and absorbing information constantly. So I think that's kind of the best advice I could give in that space.
Awesome. Yeah.
That's a fantastic piece of advice, and something I want to follow up with you on, because that would have been my other question if we weren't out of time, because just thinking about big picture, how we can make a big difference in terms of communication. And I think you sort of addressed that in that, at least that little snippet there. So thanks for everyone's attention. Luisa, thank you for a very compelling and very informative talk. And for those of you listening to this recording, stay tuned. We hope to have another one of these next year. And if you have interest in the Big Earth Hackathon and other wildfire related things, my email is on the original slide, but it's dfong@stanford.edu. Thank you again, Luisa. Everyone have a great afternoon, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.